So horticultural societies have been around for quite a while, but not nearly as long as foragers. Um, so in the relatively recent past, several thousands of years, people started to do this sort of low technology farming. So horticulture is a production system based on low technology farming or gardening without the use of plows, draft animals, irrigation, or fertilizer. So this is generally characterized by slash and burn, or what we sometimes call swidden agriculture. What they would do is they would have a relatively stable uh, place that they would reside. So they would have houses and things like that built, but they would be semi-permanent houses. They weren't meant to stay there forever. And they would have fields around the houses where they would burn down the forest or whatever vegetation was there, and that would make the ground very nitrogen rich and ready to plant some very basic food stuff, probably potatoes, stuff that grows. You just put it on the ground or you dig a little bit and you just put it and plant it, and then you don't do anything. You're not out there constantly weeding, constantly spraying. There's not a lot to do. You just burn the forest, plant the seed, let it grow, and then you can eat it. But they're usually horticulturists are usually also mixing this with gathering, with foraging. So they will have their sort of gardens and things like that built up around their houses, but they will also be going into the forest and collecting wild food stuff from animals and plants. So they might be fishermen or something like that. You saw this in the film we watched with Malinowski and the Trobriand Islands, how they were gardeners, but they would also go on these fishing expeditions. Fishing is a kind of gathering because they were not domesticated fish. Okay. So if you told me that a culture was a horticultural society, I would guess that their gender relations vary quite a bit because it depends on the environment in which they're in, and sometimes men have very strict roles. Sometimes in these groups, men are warriors, and so men have a little bit different labor and are doing different kinds of things than women are, and so you can have a fairly varied gender relationship between men and women, but there are also horticultural societies that are relatively egalitarian, and men and women are relatively equal. So as a group of people, the people are starting to organize. It takes a certain amount of organization for people to build semi-permanent houses and for them to decide as a group which part of the forest they are going to burn, um, and when they're going to pick up their entire town after they've burnt a certain area for several times and planted several times. That's no longer going to yield the same amount of food, and so they'll just pick up their entire village and move several kilometers away and start again. And it's very sustainable. You can do this over and over and over as long as you don't have very high population density of different groups of people doing it. So you do need some sort of political system, some sort of body of people that are making decisions and know how to do these kinds of things. But you're not getting kings and queens or anything like that. There might be elected officials, or there might be a group of elders or village chiefs that are seen as the people that make the decisions, big men. So the group structure tends to be larger because you can support a larger population with this kind of low technology agriculture. You can support a larger population by having a relatively stable supply of food coming from the garden and also from foraging. And again, these are semi-permanent villages that are shifting their fields back and forth. So that's horticulturist, low technology farming combined with foraging. The next mode of subsistence we're going to be talking about is pastoralists, or animal herders, they're sometimes called. These are also relatively recent because it wasn't all that long ago that we started domesticating animals. In terms of humans' long, long history, in terms of the recent past, okay? So they would have cropped up around the same time as horticulturists, starting to domesticate cattle, starting to domesticate reindeer, these sorts of animals, goats, sheep. So it's a pastoralist is a productive system based on domesticated animals as the main source of food. They might also do some foraging. They might also do a little bit of gardening, like a horticulturist, right? But their main source of food is animals in the form of meat, milk, blood, yogurt, and butter. So, yeah, these are domesticated animals too. This isn't a group of people that are hunting hunting constantly and eating wild animals as their main source of food. That almost never works. It never really creates enough food for people. They always need a mix of that. But when you start domesticating animals, you can use them as your main source of food. So, in these groups of people, the gender relations tend to be very male dominated. They're working with these big, gigantic animals, and it's sort of the men's job to control the animals. And because men have control over the main source of food for the entire group, they also control, you know, all the milk, meat, butter, blood, yogurt, and the product of production, what they're making. They control the food. And so they tend to be mostly male dominated. But there is some variation. Their political systems are semi-centralized. You do need a certain amount of political system of politics in order to decide which groups of people can take their animals out to what pastures. You want to make sure that you're not overgrazing or any particular area. You want to kind of control that. You don't want to totally destroy a landscape and have the plants not come back because you've overgrazed. So you need a certain amount of political system just to control that. But it does vary a lot. Sometimes the animals are owned by the group, and sometimes there's private ownership where a certain individual might have a very large herd of animals, and other individuals or families might have a very small herd of animals. So there's sort of this economic inequality that you start seeing in these groups of people that you haven't really seen before. And so the group structure varies. Sometimes they're very, very nomadic, and they're just constantly moving around across a very large range of area, and sometimes they're only semi-nomadic. So they might have a sort of semi-permanent village, and then they take their animals and they take their animals out for long periods of time to be to different pastures, and then come back to the village from time to time. Pastoralists will also sometimes use slash and burn agriculture, and they will also sometimes use gardening. So if they have a semi-permanent village, they might have some small gardens around there in case there's a plague that knocks out, or a disease that knocks out a big portion of their animals. It's sort of a fallback plan, sort of a social safety net for them. But they tend not to use it as their main source of food in good weather and good times.